مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. في ميزانيته الجديدة قدم الرئيس ترامب أدلة ملموسة على أنه يريد تقليص حجم الحكومة الفيدرالية، حيث قطع وعودا بحفظ كبير للإنفاق على الموضوعات بداية من الإسكان إلى التعليم إلى وزارة الخارجية. ولكن كان هناك جزء واحد من الحكومة اختفى بإعلان ميزانية الرئيس لأنه تلقى زيادة كبيرة في الإنفاق، البنتاغون. في مدينة يؤد فيها المال أداة مؤشر على القوة، أبرز التحول في الأولويات جانبا مهما في النفوذ السياسي في واشنطن، التأثير المتنامي للجيش. من الناحية العملية ماذا يعني هذا الأمر؟ كيف ستؤثر التغييرات في الإنفاق على الحكومة؟ هل هو أمر طيب أم سيء أم غير ذي أهمية أن الجنرالات الآن يديرون وزارات الدفاع ومجلس الأمن القومي؟ كيف يؤثر هذا على العلاقات بين المسؤولين المدنيين والجيش؟ كيف يؤثر هذا الاتجاه على الأمن القومي والسياسة الخارجية؟ لمناقشة التأثير المتسائل للجيش في إدارة ترامب، يسرني أن أرحب بالصحفيين مرموقين يتناولان قضايا الدفاع، وهما ترافيس تريتين وبريان بندر. Welcome back to Dakhel Washington. If it's one thing we can say about President Trump, he likes the military. And today we're going to talk about military defense and national security with two outstanding experts. Thank you very much for joining us, Travis and Brian. Now, let's first follow the money. The president's budget came out, and there were a lot of losers, but one really big winner, and that's the Pentagon. Brian, what do the numbers tell us?
Well, the president has requested about a $52 billion increase over what was planned for the fiscal year or for the new year 2018 coming up. And as you pointed out, that's really the one part of his budget that really is getting a big boost. And to fund that, the president is proposing cuts elsewhere, including some very deep cuts in diplomacy. Deep cuts to the State Department that will then help fund some additional ships, planes, more training for the military. President Trump ran on a platform in which he said he was going to rebuild the American military. And so one of the things that he has followed through on, at least somewhat, is this proposal to really increase the Pentagon's budget, give them more resources to do more things.
And so, Travis, is this $50+ billion to purchase things, or to support people, or a bit of both?
Well, you have to say that there was some disappointment over President Trump's budget. The president campaigned on, and he's promised as president, to have an army of 540,000 soldiers, a major increase, a navy of 350 ships, also a major increase, hundreds of more fighter aircraft. But what we see in this budget is not so much procurement and more weapons. Basically what the Pentagon is saying is that they're going to shore up the existing forces that they have now. And this anticipated military buildup, it's not going to come until next year, is what we're hearing.
So this extra $50 billion really is not a big expenditure? The Pentagon wanted a lot more than this?
Well, I think it's a significant expenditure, but what you have is, and the defense talks on Capitol Hill would tell you this, that for years, since the ground wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we've seen military spending dropping off. And you've also seen the military with just as many responsibilities around the world. So our military is really kind of stretched thin, and they've had hard financial times. So this budget is a significant increase, but it's really needed to make improvements to what we already have, rather than building the size of the military.
And so, Brian, in terms of the defense part of the budget, How was it received on Capitol Hill?
I think it's pretty widely supported, this idea that the military does need some additional funds. I think Travis is right. This is probably more of a down payment on this military buildup that Trump has talked about. But, you know, $50 billion is a lot of money. It is a pretty significant increase. You know, the U.S. military still spends more money than a lot of other nations, major powers combined. But to your question, I think Democrats and Republicans fairly uniformly support the idea that we need to make sure the military has what it needs, has some additional resources. But I think there's real debate over how to pay for it. And so that the Congress has not really grappled with yet. There's some real criticism about the cuts that I mentioned, so cutting the State Department, cutting some other social programs in order to pay for this increase. And you know, there's Democrats in particular who are very opposed to that. They want to fund the Pentagon, give the Pentagon what it needs, but they feel like there should be increases elsewhere in the government budget, and that's not accounted for.
So, Travis, let me ask you, generals have in recent weeks been speaking up on this issue, saying, yes, please fund us, but don't fund the other part of our foreign affairs, don't defund the other part of our foreign affairs, our soft power, our diplomacy and development. Is that just for show? Is that for real? Is the White House listening to the generals that are saying, please fund the State Department?
What Mattis said when he was asked about this is he said, yes, we need a whole of government approach, but he's not commenting on the State Department plans, which are significant cuts. He's focused in on the Pentagon, the Department of Defense. And what he's said is budgets right now are their biggest enemy. What they need right now is more funding. And what they're facing this fall is a budget cap. So Congress is going to need to figure out some way to come to a solution and raise that cap. And that's what he wants most of all.
I see. All right, so let's expand this discussion. We just referred to General Mattis, the Secretary of Defense. I want to ask you both about generals in government. We now have not just a recently retired general as Secretary of Defense and a currently serving general as the head of the National Security Council. Is this unusual? Are there advantages? Are there disadvantages? Brian, what's your view?
I think America has a long history of relying on retired generals who then go into civilian government positions. I think where there is some concern in the Trump era is that the president, as you said at the outset, seems to really like generals. There's something about military men that either impresses him or perhaps he sees a little bit of himself in them, sort of the man in charge, if you will. And there's no doubt that these men have a lot of experience in military affairs. Some have a lot of experience in international affairs and diplomacy because generals have to deal with foreign governments. I think where the concern lies, are you now is President Trump relying on too much military-related advice? You also have a Secretary of State that has no experience at all, really, in government, who's supposed to be the chief diplomat. So I think there is some concern that when you're looking at that small group of people that are advising the president on international crises, are you hearing from people whose really entire life experience is, you know, the military and is fighting wars? And so do they look at every problem through a military lens? In other words, every problem needs some kind of military solution. So I think there is concern about that. I think at the same time, sort of ironically, some people who are worried that President Trump is not fit for the job, who doesn't have enough experience, well, at least he has a bunch of generals around him who can give him some good advice.
So is this a legitimate set of concerns, Travis?
I think so. I agree with what Brian said. But I think, too, that there was the pick of Mattis and of McMaster. It gave a lot of assurances to a lot of folks in Washington who were very concerned about the Trump administration and its level of experience with dealing with foreign policy and defense. And Mattis and McMaster, they're both intellectuals. They're big picture thinkers. They understand that you need foreign policy to go along with military policy. So I think people are really relying on them to take the United States forward. And I think there's a lot of confidence in their leadership abilities.
And just specifically about General Mattis, What do we know, if anything, about the relationship between, say, this former general and the civilian side of the Pentagon, and between this former general and all the other generals on the Joint Chiefs? After all, he was never a member of the Joint Chiefs.
Yeah. It's interesting. We have this cluster of generals, and Brian is absolutely right. There's a long history in the United States of military leaders coming across and running the government. But this cluster of generals is kind of unusual, and you have four basically generals. Three of them retired, and one, McMaster, is still serving. They were all steeped in the Iraq war and the Afghanistan war. They came up through that. And I think they see the world through that lens. So it's a very interesting situation dynamic that you have these people who helped run these wars, and who are now charged with bringing them to some type of conclusion.
Okay, when we come back, we're going to talk about operationally what does it mean to devolve some authority, such as troop levels, to these generals, in an unusual decision by the president recently. And what can we learn by the early signs of how the president and the administration have used military force? In just a moment. Our guests today include Travis Trittin. Travis is a defense and national security reporter at the Washington Examiner, and there he helps compile the Daily on Defense newsletter. He has 15 years' experience reporting on the military, government, and politics, both here in the United States and abroad. Previously, he was the Capitol Hill reporter at Stars and Stripes newspaper, and he spent 7 years as the Japan correspondent, where he covered the 2011 earthquake and nuclear disaster, the Iraq War, and anti-terrorism operations in the Philippines. Sitting to his right is Brian Bender. Brian is the defense editor for Politico. He was previously a Washington-based reporter for the Boston Globe and for Jane's Defense Weekly, where he covered U.S. military operations in the Middle East, Asia, Latin America, and the Balkans. He also writes about terrorism, the international arms trade, and government secrecy. Shh! He is the author of You're Not Forgotten, the story of an Iraq War veteran's search for a missing World War II fighter pilot in the South Pacific. So, gentlemen, just recently the White House seemed to devolve or give authority to the Pentagon for something which is traditionally a White House decision, namely how many troops the United States should be dispatching in Afghanistan. Brian, why this White House move, implications, and what is the Pentagon supposed to decide about this?
Well, I think there's two things that are driving President Trump's decision to empower military commanders more. One, we've already talked about, which is his affinity for generals. And his view that they are, qualified, prepared, can-do kind of people. I want to let them do what they know how to do best. And I think the second driver is, like a lot of the president's policies, it's sort of undoing what his predecessor, President Obama, did. And in some ways, on this issue, I think the pendulum has swung almost all the way back. And by that I mean, President Obama was criticized for often micromanaging military operations. The White House wanted to know where every boot was going to go, how many troops were going to be there, who was going to be in charge. Conducted a lot of oversight of these decisions.
So, Travis, how is this being welcomed in the Pentagon? And are there some saying, well, maybe we actually want the White House to have some responsibility here, because otherwise we're going to own this entire issue all by ourselves?
That's right. This is now Mattis's war, especially in Afghanistan. And I think there are questions over what difference are these 4,000 troops going to make? And if you look back at the history of the war in Afghanistan, Mattis's strategy is that we're going to focus on building up the Afghan security forces so that they can protect a stable government in Kabul. But since after 9/11, the U.S. has been focusing on this idea. This is not a new idea. And there have been troop surges in the past. Bush had his troop surge. Obama had his troop surges. So I think the real question here is, what is Mattis bringing to the table that's different? And how is this going to turn the tide in Afghanistan?
So let's see if we can draw any lessons from the Trump administration's use of military force, because in fact we've had a handful of episodes. What can we conclude from the decision-making process and the preferences of the administration in terms of the use of military force? Travis, why don't you begin?
Well, I think basically this administration is just much more willing to use military force. The Obama administration was very hesitant. Their goal seemed to be draw down these wars and these conflicts overseas, and they were very cautious about the use. Trump has come in, and what we've seen is this delegation of authority to his military leaders. We saw the cruise missile strike in Syria, redrawing that red line for the Assad regime. It seems to be a more aggressive policy, definitely, with this administration, first and foremost.
Brian?
I think the two biggest examples, and Travis has touched on this, of the president's approach to military force, or his administration's approach, because the military does make more decisions, was the dropping of the massive bomb on the cave network in Afghanistan, targeting the Islamic State.
This is the mother of all bombs.
The Moab, as they call it. And that was, as far as we can tell, a decision really made by the commander on the ground, who had been considering this for some months, even before President Trump came into office, but never got the sign-off up the chain of command. And so that was an example of the military being able to do something that maybe it had wanted to do before. Travis mentioned the cruise missile strike on the Syrian regime after the use of chemical weapons. I think that was a clear statement by the president that there's a new sheriff in town. Obama claimed or threatened that he was going to punish the Syrian regime and Bashar al-Assad for using these outlawed weapons. As we know, President Obama did not follow through for a variety of reasons. And so, I think those are the two biggest examples. I think it remains to be seen how different the approach to military force really will be, because I think we forget that President Obama was quite willing to use military force, but in very specific circumstances, clearly, taking out alleged terrorist leaders, drone strikes.
Well, I wanted to ask you, we know that President Obama seemed to like special forces and drones. Do we know what President Trump seems to like?
I think President Trump seems to like whatever his military commanders tell him they want and they need. I mean, I think that's what we've seen so far. But I think clearly President Trump, by allowing the Pentagon to substantially increase troops in Afghanistan, clearly believes that they can make a difference. I think President Obama thought after 15 plus years of troops in Afghanistan that there's maybe not a whole lot more that American troops can do. But we'll see. I mean, they're going to train more Afghan security forces. They're going to help the Afghan government try to sort of hold the line against the Taliban, and maybe that will make some difference over the next couple of years. But the big question remains: what comes next? I mean, is America going to keep thousands of troops in Afghanistan forever? I mean, we're coming up on an entire generation now that we have had substantial numbers in Afghanistan, and I think a lot of people can't really point to what's really significantly changed about it.
And how would the Pentagon answer that question?
Well, what Mattis has said is that he's defined a new tactic. What he says is a new tactic, which is encircling groups of Islamic State fighters and eliminating them. His argument is in the past that we've allowed them to escape and move into other areas. So this is a method of elimination for these. But again, that's a tactic, right? It's not a long-term strategy. And we've yet to see the long-term strategy in Afghanistan. Now, Mattis has said that's coming. It's weeks away. It looks like we're going to have an additional 4,000 troops going there before we see that strategy. But the administration is promising that it's coming. So I think a lot of people are waiting to see what exactly this is going to look like. What is it, and how is it different to what we've been doing in the past?
So, gentlemen, we only have a minute left. I want to ask both of you, since you cover these issues so closely, what is the most important underreported story in the defense and military side of our national coverage that, that our listeners and viewers should know more about? Brian, why don't you start?
The United States and Russia are kicking off a new nuclear arms race, and nobody's paying attention, and virtually no one in Washington is talking about it.
That sounds like a significant story. All right. Travis?
I think it's that this military buildup that Trump has been promising for so long is really uncertain at this point. I think there's a lot of doubt of whether this is going to come, when it's going to come, and if it's ever going to come. We see all this turmoil on Capitol Hill, and I'm not sure they can come to an agreement that's going to allow it to happen.
So we're spending a lot on nuclear weapons, but we're not, it's unclear whether or not we're going to fulfill our promises on good old-fashioned defense spending.
I think that's right.
Okay, fascinating. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on Dakhel Washington.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول دور الجيش في إدارة ترامب، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@elhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.